Hello.
Hello, everybody. Just gonna give it a minute.
Oh, hi. Now someone said something. Now I know that my headphones work.
I guess we're a quiet bunch.
Unless there's a variable to be named.
That's the second item. Do one more minute. Cool. Can everyone see the screen? All right. Let's kick it off to Matt, JR, and Danger D.
Jira there.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. So this is basically a proposal that came up, well, I guess came up in the past. I think Dan has an issue from January called feature gates, where the idea is to have a flag under which we can enable or disable certain features.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you. You're very quiet. Are you able to move closer to your microphone?
Is it better now?
Not really, I'm afraid. I'll just turn up my earphones.
Okay. I mean, I'm as close as I can be from my laptop, right? Yeah, so the idea is to have a flag where we could enable features that maybe not all customers want, and those features might be what people would reject in that working group. So, for example, something I discussed 2 weeks ago and 3 weeks ago, I think, the downward API, where putting the downward API support in the Knative API itself is a bit tricky because we want it to be independent from Kubernetes as much as we can. And instead of trying to abstract it in like a convoluted way where we could say, I mean, we discussed that already, but there's all sorts of very weird way we can abstract downward API into the Knative API, whether it is creating our own downward API or having some sort of bindings where we can bind some profile into a Knative service. The profile would be dependent on the platform. The idea was it would be easier since there's a lot of push from customers that want to use downward API, more advanced volume types, node selectors, etc., to just put that under a flag, and we could just add that. And because it's under a flag, it's not really under the Knative API. And eventually, maybe we can graduate it under the Knative API, but maybe not. I don't know if that was super clear, but maybe you can.
Yeah, so I can try and give my own spin on it. So basically, there's a whole bunch of properties that we think are sort of leaky, and we've turned them off. And there's no way, they're only accessible through the pod spec, and we have no way of turning them back on, right? And we've floated this idea of the binding, the operator binding. So there's a separate API for like operators. Dan played with that, and he said it was sort of unwieldy when we sunk up with him, I think Monday afternoon. And so it basically the sort of pragmatic alternative was, what if we just had a flag that was exposed to operators that basically let through the set of fields that aren't necessarily gonna break stateless workloads in ways by letting you introduce state, but are things that we've sort of I guess turned our nose at as being sort of leaky abstractions in the sort of pure serverless sense. And so things like node selectors, things like things that leak through aspects of pods into the API, like the downward API, and things like the host IP, et cetera. I think things that have come up in the past are things like runtime class and a few other things. So yeah, effectively having just a knob that's accessible to operators to give folks on their cluster access to these sort of leaky things, and unblocking the sort of slew of things that have built up behind this unsolved problem. Does that make sense?
Can people give a thumbs up if they made sense? Okay. One. Everyone else has their video off, so. Okay, cool.
So yeah, I think the idea is that we'd effectively introduce, so the whole leaky abstraction thing is also sort of a whack-a-mole thing. And I think the problem is right now we don't really have a mallet to use to whack the moles, and let things through as folks are asking for them. And so we have a pile of moles to whack, but I think that we want to be sort of somewhat intentional about, as we're letting these things through, making sure we have testing and whatnot for them. I think part of how we balance the fact that it's accessible in some contexts and not others is also through the way we frame wording in the control plane spec around must versus should, et cetera. So we'll also want to make sure that we keep some of those artifacts up to date as we plumb through some of these new things.
Can I suggest something slightly different? Which is the ability to, first of all, a feature flag to turn on whitelisting of pod spec fields, and then another like config map or similar where an administrator can provide the additional fields that they are prepared to whitelist. And the reason for two is that the first one should be named something like dangerous pod spec whitelist or unsupported pod spec whitelist, to emphasize that while you can do this in your local environment, there is no guarantee that Knative won't come and do something different or break it somehow. It also stops us having to have the debate about what that flag should be called every time somebody comes with a field that they need.
So you would have a flag per field in the pod spec, or is it more like per feature?
I'm not entirely sure off the top of my head, but I think it would take something of the form of one flag, like basically operator flag that says, I'm enabling this unsafe, unsupported feature for whitelisting pod spec fields. And then I would assume it would be a config map of like fields, a list of fields that you are enabling. And we have logic at the moment, which essentially does a filtering by copying fields from the incoming to the one we create. And, it would consult that config map. And if it found one, it would override its own default logic. And in fact, we might later on decide to replace our logic with a default config map of allowed whitelisted fields.
Right. But do we need the 2 layers? I mean, because then the logic of what is allowed, not allowed is going to be more complex than the actual feature. Like, I feel like might be.
So can I counter your counter proposal with my own counter proposal? So one of the things we talked about was, in K8s API style, bools are, so last season, and enums are the sort of way to express some of this stuff, right? I mean, we can start with a toggle that's basically like, what we have today, strict mode, whatever we want to call it, and then we can have the sort of ultra permissive YOLO mode that lets everything through. And if folks really come to us wanting the filtered mode, right, we can add another value to the enum and some complementary field that sort of regulates the flow of fields. Yeah, I mean, I don't think your proposal is necessarily different, maybe an extension of, I think probably where we'd want to end up anyways. Does that make sense, Jacques?
It does. I will present the sub argument against allowing a YOLO mode. One of the advantages of whitelisting is that it remains like it's a fail secure situation as new fields are added. You have to, as an operator, keep making the decision consciously that you want to enable that field and that you're cognizant of the risks. With a YOLO mode, it's fail dangerous. It fails open, and every time Kubernetes gets upgraded, there might be a field that they might have wished that they turned off but didn't realize or didn't think to do, or it fell off the list. Whereas if it fails closed, then basically they get a ping from the app developer saying we want this, and then they get to decide.
I mean, they're still restricted to pod spec, right? I mean, so we're talking about workloads where if they were spinning it up as a K8s deployment, right? Like these are things that they could do, right? So, I mean, they're still sort of within the constraints of that. But yeah, it would open the door to, I won't say all, but many of the things you could do with, a K8s deployment. And I think we'll still, like I said, want to be sort of somewhat intentional about letting things, through into YOLO mode. We have a mode in which you can access some of the stuff that, is leaky, right? I mean, I also think we should separate out sort of dangerous things from leaky things, because I don't think they're necessarily one and the same, but
a question I have, should the user be aware that these fields are whitelisted? Because for example, if I go to a specific vendor, start using certain fields, and that might be my first experience using Knative APIs. Thus, if I want to migrate to something else, it might come as a shock that all of a sudden, hey, these fields are not allowed that I was previously using in another thing. Any thoughts on that, or a best way to service it? Like, one thought, at least I have, is like, should users also opt into it? So it becomes like an explicit action they take for that reason.
That's a good question. So I think the operator control needs to be able to trump, because it needs to be, I think, allowed in the context. But I think the middle ground there would be, suppose I, as a user of this, uninhibited Knative installation, want to sort of keep myself honest in terms of portability. Is there, something like an annotation I can put on my resources that, says I want to stay within the sort of pure subset? It's an interesting idea. Maybe we should do that. Although I think, to the sort of portability question, I think that, the benchmark for that is supposed to be conformance, right? And the only thing that folks, I don't know that we do a great job of sort of, for lack of a better word, litigating this, but if folks want to use the Knative brand and say something is sort of, Knative compatible, right? Like that is the purpose of conformance, and that they should be, they must be doing all of the things that use the word must, and they can use discretion when it comes to things that are should, etc. And so I think these new things would all be under the sort of should banner. And so I think the point around wanting to stay in sort of a sort of pure mode, I don't know that it necessarily just applies to the fields that we're talking about in this sort of, I'll keep calling it YOLO mode. I think it also potentially applies to other fields that are currently should. But that the analogy that JR made in our conversation Monday was sort of a reference to .NET and how they're sort of you can compile C# code in like pure mode and get access to unsafe subsets of .NET, etc. Right? So this is sort of like I stick within all of the musts as sort of like I think what I think of when I think of sort of pure .NET code. Does that accurately capture the analogy you made, JR?
Yes. Yeah. But to come back to the point of how we could present that to the user is, we could say it's extensions, or I don't know what's the right naming, but instead of features or extensions, or something that's clear that it's not necessarily everywhere, but I'm not exactly sure on the right wording there.
Yeah, because I've written that C# code for phone, Windows 8, whatever, and those are explicit architect. You have to explicitly architect things differently, which is interesting. So it was very much like a forefront thing you need to do, right?
Right, and I take your point that like there's no good way to like know you're staying within that sort of pure subset the way we've written things today, run it. I'm sure I can count on my hands the number of customers who are like, I'm going to run conformance, right? So, maybe we should provide, some way of, annotating things in a way that our validating webhooks or whatever can be like, yeah, okay, you are using the. I don't think we can do it with a runtime contract because it's.
No, yeah.
But the control plane spec, I think, it might. I don't know that we need to couple it with this because I think that's a separable and really interesting idea. It may be something worth pursuing as well.
Cool.
I have a quick question. I was wondering, do you guys foresee this as being, so we've talked a little bit about fields that might be, say, vendor supported. What about, for example, introducing new behaviors? Do we, or as well as like, what happens if some of these things become ubiquitous? Do we foresee us being able to like graduate things from this permissive mode into the core? or is this sort of like a permanent state of YOLO mode versus pure mode?
You know, it's an interesting question. You know, I think that there are probably a couple categories. You know, in particular, the one we're talking about here, I think, is sort of targeting leaky abstractions that you know, it might not apply to non-k8s environments, right? Which, you know, there are implementations, as you're aware of, that, you know, the same idioms don't necessarily apply. But, you know, I think there's also features that we may want a separate way of gating, like whether or not they are accessible yet, such as, you know, the next topic on our agenda, which is multi-container support, right? Where we want to sort of progressively introduce it because it is a big new moving part. And I think eventually we want to have it accessible without the flag. Because I don't know that it's necessarily leaking the fact that, you know, you are spinning up k8s pods under the hood. It's, you know, it's a pod spec in the sense of multiple containers running in, you know, shared network namespace, et cetera.
Yeah, and that's sort of what I mean is that, you know, when I see feature gates like this, I think not only like, you know, vendor specific stuff, but also like as a release process, you know, we have each version, but not on a feature by feature basis. I could see this being used for something like an experimental or a beta channel for new behaviors as well.
Yeah, so I guess my point is, I think that we want something similar for the sort of experimental, not experimental functionality that will graduate. But I think things within the sort of leaky abstraction category, I wouldn't see us graduating to, you know, being available without the leaky abstraction flag, right? Like, I mean, to return to the sort of .NET pure assembly analogy, right? Like, the unsafe things don't necessarily, you know, magically become, you know, safe to do in a pure context, you know, over time, right? But there may be new features that, you know, are accessible through, you know, pure .NET, pure assemblies, right? Or unsafe in those respective contexts, right? That we may want to gate through, you know, feature flagging and, you know, some progression from, you know, experimental to, you know, GA.
Cool. I'm going to call time if anyone wants to say anything else on this. Okay, cool. Moving on. I guess, GR, do you have kind of the clarity and foresight you need to move forward with some of this?
No, I guess we'll come back with some doc for next week where everyone can comment and we have more details, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, sounds good. I put the next item on just to kind of raise awareness of a discussion that me and Savita were having. Essentially, as part of the multi-container work, we want to resolve multiple digests. And kind of the conclusion or observation I had is we're initially what was embedded in the status of the revision was essentially like a image digest array that had a container name in the image digest. I was kind of foreseeing that there might be at a future point additional things that might need to be surfaced in regards to the container. So I was suggesting that we rename this image digest to like a container status. So this is sort of like analogous to how PodSpec has an array of container statuses. And right now they have, for example, like the state of it, exited and things like that. And for now, I think like the simplest thing we'll do is just for our revision container status, just have the name and image digest that was resolved. And then this now creates sort of like an place where we can add an extension for additional container properties. So I just wanted to raise awareness and see if anyone had any concerns, or if Savita, if you have anything else you want to add to the discussion.
One question here is like, so when we say container status, so other than so we are proposing this, thinking that in future we may add some of the fields to this container status, like it can be status or something ID or something like that to the status of container.
Yeah, like for example, if for some reason users want more visibility of the container details as part of the revision, as opposed to going, or actually that doesn't work because of the pod scale. I could imagine there be additional properties that are unique to per container that need some translation, similar to the tag to digest resolution, that might surface. This would be the place to surface that. I don't know what those are right now.
Okay.
So I
Maybe container size isn't the right word, but
I kind of like the parallel to the pod spec thing, although I think it's notable that like, I don't think this appears in deployment status because of the replication. But there are ways we surface like container exit message and things like that in our shared status today, where it may be useful to incorporate some of that into a context like this. Assuming we can make sense of the that in the context of replication.
cool. Like just 2 more minutes. Anyone else have any thoughts? This is your bike shedding moment, Jacques.
Well, I was thinking hot pink, and failing that, just a really like nice mauve.
We're gonna make it pop. Okay.
Exactly. Make it
I guess
dynamic.
for those that want a bike shed, we can do it on the PR 7373. Does anyone have anything else they want to talk about? No? Okay. You can have your 1 minute back. Have fun, everybody.
Yay, bye.
Bye.